What happens when one unexpected comment on a live daytime talk show changes the atmosphere in an instant, leaving the audience wondering whether they're about to witness one of television's most unforgettable exchanges. One sentence, one pause, one look across the stage, and suddenly, every person in the studio is holding their breath, waiting to see who speaks next. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to Prime Spotlight, give this video a like, and share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoy dramatic, celebrity-inspired stories and cinematic, what-if moments, you're in the right place. The bright studio lights reflected across the polished stage as the familiar applause echoed through the room. Cameras swept across the audience before settling on the panel, where the conversation had already shifted through several topics. Everything felt comfortable, predictable, even cheerful. Then the host welcomed Charlize Theron onto the stage. The applause grew louder. Charlize walked in with her signature calm confidence, smiling warmly as she greeted each host before taking her seat. She looked relaxed, exchanging jokes with the panel as the audience laughed along. For the first several minutes, the interview flowed effortlessly. They discussed filmmaking. They talked about balancing career and family. They laughed over awkward moments from movie sets. Even the crew behind the cameras seemed unusually relaxed. But underneath the easy conversation, there was an invisible shift beginning to form. One topic led naturally into another. The discussion turned toward public expectations placed on celebrities. Charlize answered thoughtfully. "I've always believed people should be allowed to grow," she said. "None of us are exactly the same person we were 10 years ago." Several audience members nodded. One of the hosts smiled. Another leaned forward with curiosity. Then Whoopi Goldberg folded her hands together. She waited until the room became quiet. "You know," she began carefully, "sometimes public figures say they're changing, but audiences don't always feel that change is reflected in their actions." The audience became noticeably quieter. Charlize continued listening. Whoopi wasn't raising her voice. Neither was Charlize. Yet something about the conversation suddenly felt heavier. Whoopi continued. "Sometimes people hear carefully prepared answers during interviews, but they're looking for something deeper than words." Charlize nodded slowly. "I understand that." There was another pause. Then Whoopi added one final thought. "Do you think actors sometimes spend too much time protecting their image instead of simply being honest?" Silence. Not uncomfortable. Not yet. Just enough silence for every camera operator to instinctively zoom in. Charlize looked down for a brief moment before looking back up. A polite smile remained on her face. But her expression had changed. The audience sensed it immediately. Even those watching from home could almost feel the temperature inside the studio shift. Charlize answered softly. "I think honesty comes in different forms." Whoopi listened. Charlize continued. "Sometimes people mistake privacy for avoidance." The audience murmured. Charlize wasn't speaking emotionally. She wasn't defensive. She was measured, careful. Every word sounded deliberate. Whoopi nodded. "But if you're in the public eye," she replied, "doesn't that come with accepting questions people may not like?" Charlize smiled again. "It absolutely does." She paused. "But answering difficult questions doesn't always mean surrendering every personal thought." The audience applauded lightly. One host quietly glanced toward another. Something told everyone this discussion was becoming far more significant than anyone expected. The cameras continued rolling. Charlize leaned back slightly. "When someone spends decades working," she said, "people naturally build expectations about who they think you are." She laughed gently. "The funny thing is, sometimes strangers become more certain about your life than you are." The audience laughed. Even Whoopi smiled. For a brief second, the tension seemed to disappear. Then another host asked a question that changed everything. "So how do you respond when people believe you're carefully controlling your public image?" Charlize's smile faded. Only slightly. She took a slow breath. "I don't believe protecting your peace is the same thing as protecting an image." Complete silence. The audience stopped moving. Whoopi looked directly at Charlize. "That's an interesting distinction." Charlize nodded. "I've spent enough years learning that saying less doesn't necessarily mean hiding something." Several audience members applauded. Others simply watched. The energy inside the studio had completely transformed. No one was checking phones. No one whispered. Every eye remained fixed on the stage. Whoopi crossed one leg over the other. "Some viewers," she said carefully, "might argue public figures have a responsibility to answer difficult conversations directly." Charlize answered almost immediately. I don't disagree. She leaned slightly forward. But responsibility goes both ways. The audience reacted with another wave of applause. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Charlize's voice stayed calm. I think interviewers also carry responsibility. That sentence landed differently. The applause faded. Even the production crew seemed frozen. Charlize continued. If someone sits across from you trusting they'll have a genuine conversation, then both people deserve to feel heard, not just challenged. A few audience members quietly clapped again. Others exchanged surprised looks. The discussion no longer sounded like a celebrity interview. It sounded like two experienced professionals carefully testing each other's ideas. Whoopi smiled politely. I've always believed asking difficult questions is part of respecting the audience. Charlize nodded without hesitation. And I've always believed thoughtful answers deserve thoughtful listening. The audience responded with noticeably louder applause. One camera briefly captured several people smiling. Another showed someone whispering, wow, the atmosphere had become electric. Not because anyone was yelling. Not because anyone had insulted another. But because neither woman seemed willing to step away from the conversation. Each answer invited another question. Each pause carried more weight than the last. Somewhere behind the cameras, producers exchanged quick glances. This wasn't following the expected interview outline anymore. It had become something completely different. Something no one wanted to interrupt. Charlize folded her hands together and looked toward the audience before returning her attention to the panel. She smiled. I think the most interesting conversations happen when nobody is trying to win. Whoopi looked at her for a long moment. Then she slowly leaned forward. That's true, she said quietly. But what happens when two people completely disagree about what honesty looks like? The audience collectively leaned in. Charlize opened her mouth to answer. And suddenly, every person in the studio realized the conversation had reached a turning point. One that neither side could simply laugh away. The next few words would determine whether this remained a respectful discussion or became the unforgettable television moment everyone would be talking about long after the cameras stopped rolling. The silence that followed Whoopi's question seemed to stretch far longer than it actually did. The studio audience barely moved. Even the familiar sounds of cameras repositioning around the stage felt unusually loud. Every face in the room turned toward Charlize, waiting to hear how she would respond. Charlize remained composed. She offered a small smile, not one of amusement, but one that suggested she had carefully chosen not to react emotionally. I think honesty, she finally said, can exist even when two people see the same situation differently. Whoopi nodded slowly. I agree with that. There was another pause. But sometimes, Whoopi continued, people use that idea to avoid accountability. A few audience members murmured. Charlize kept her eyes fixed on Whoopi. And sometimes, she replied evenly, people mistake disagreement for avoidance. The room erupted with scattered applause. One host glanced toward the audience before looking back at Charlize. The conversation had reached a different level now. This was no longer about movie promotions or celebrity headlines. It had become a discussion about expectations, perception, and the pressure that comes with living in the public eye. Charlize leaned forward slightly. I've spent years answering questions from journalists around the world. Some interviews stay with me because they challenged me. Others stay with me because they reminded me how easy it is for assumptions to replace curiosity. Whoopi listened without interrupting. Charlize continued. When someone walks into an interview, they're already carrying months or years of stories that have been written about them. Sometimes those stories become louder than the person sitting in the chair. The audience applauded again. Whoopi rested her hands on the table. But viewers also deserve clarity, she said. They don't want polished answers. They want authenticity. Charlize nodded immediately. I couldn't agree more. The audience looked surprised. But authenticity isn't always dramatic, Charlize added. Sometimes authenticity is simply saying, I don't have an easy answer. Several people clapped. Another host smiled, sensing that both women were making thoughtful points, even as they challenged one another. Still, the tension remained. Whoopi tilted her head. So when audiences feel they're not getting the full story, whose responsibility is that? Charlize didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked briefly toward the audience. I think everyone shares that responsibility. Whoopi raised an eyebrow. Everyone. Charlize nodded. The person speaking. The person asking. The headlines written afterward. Even the audience, because we all bring expectations into every conversation. The audience fell silent once more. It wasn't the answer many had expected. Whoopi tapped her fingers lightly on the table. I hear what you're saying. Then she added another question. But isn't there a point where public figures have to stop worrying about how they'll be perceived? Charlize smiled faintly. I stopped worrying about pleasing everyone a long time ago. The audience laughed softly. But, Charlize continued, I never stopped caring about fairness. That sentence lingered in the air. Whoopi's expression softened. Fairness can mean different things. It absolutely can, Charlize replied. And that's exactly why conversations matter. The discussion might have settled there. It almost did. Then a member of the audience was invited to ask a question. A young woman stood, holding a microphone with slightly nervous hands. My question is for both of you, she said. If two intelligent people disagree, how do you keep the conversation respectful when millions of people are watching? The audience applauded before either woman answered. Whoopi smiled. I remind myself that disagreement isn't the enemy. Charlize nodded. And I remind myself that listening isn't surrender. The audience responded with one of the loudest rounds of applause of the afternoon. For a brief moment, it seemed the atmosphere had relaxed. Then another audience member stood. My question is for Charlize. She smiled politely. Have interviews ever made you regret speaking openly? Charlize laughed quietly. More than once. The audience laughed with her. But I've also regretted staying silent. The room grew thoughtful again. There are moments, Charlize continued, when you wish you had explained yourself better. And there are moments when you realize no explanation would have changed someone's mind. Whoopi watched carefully. So what do you do then? Charlize answered almost instantly. You stop trying to control the outcome. That answer drew another wave of applause. Whoopi folded her arms thoughtfully. I think that's easier said than done. Charlize smiled. It definitely is. Another host leaned in. So if someone misunderstands your intentions, do you feel obligated to correct them? Charlize considered the question. Sometimes. She paused. But sometimes correcting every misunderstanding becomes exhausting. Whoopi nodded. I understand that feeling. There was genuine warmth in her voice. The audience noticed it immediately. For the first time since the conversation had shifted, both women seemed less like opponents and more like two professionals sharing experiences from different perspectives. Yet the calm didn't last. One of the hosts looked down at a card in front of her. I have one last question. The audience became quiet again. She looked toward Charlize. Some people believe celebrities benefit from media attention when it's positive, but criticize the media when coverage becomes uncomfortable. How do you respond to that? Charlize took a slow breath. I think that's a fair question. She paused long enough for every camera to focus tightly on her. But I also think it's possible to appreciate journalism while questioning how certain conversations are framed. Whoopi leaned forward immediately. So are you saying interviewers sometimes shape the story before it even begins? Charlize met her gaze. I'm saying first impressions are powerful. Whoopi responded quickly. And journalists would argue that preparation is part of the job. It is, Charlize replied. But assumptions can become invisible. The audience reacted with another chorus of murmurs. Whoopi smiled politely, though the intensity had returned to her eyes. You know, she said, I think audiences are smart enough to decide for themselves. Charlize smiled back. I've always believed that. Another pause. Then Charlize added quietly. That's exactly why I trust them to hear complete conversations instead of just memorable moments. The audience erupted into applause. Several people rose to their feet. Not because someone had won, but because both women had refused to reduce a complicated discussion into simple talking points. Still, there was one question left hanging in the air. Whoopi looked directly at Charlize. Her voice became softer than it had been all afternoon. If we continued this conversation after the cameras stopped rolling, would your answers be any different? The applause faded instantly. Charlize looked at her for several long seconds. A thoughtful smile crossed her face. Then she began to answer. Charlize held Whoopi's gaze for several quiet seconds before answering. The audience remained completely still, sensing that whatever came next would shape the rest of the conversation. No, Charlize said calmly. My answer would be exactly the same. The words weren't dramatic. They weren't delivered with anger or defiance. If anything, their calmness made them even more powerful. Whoopi nodded thoughtfully. So you're saying the cameras don't change who you are? Charlize smiled faintly. They shouldn't. A ripple of applause spread across the studio. Charlize continued. I've always believed that if I need two different versions of myself, one for television and one for real life, then eventually both versions become exhausting. The audience responded with warm applause. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, studying Charlize carefully. That's an admirable goal. Charlize laughed softly. I didn't say I achieve it every day. The audience laughed with her. We're all human, Charlize added. Sometimes we say the wrong thing. Sometimes we explain ourselves poorly. Sometimes we wish we had another chance. Whoopi nodded. I know that feeling. For a brief moment, the tension eased. One of the hosts joked about how every live television personality had replayed interviews in their heads long after the cameras stopped rolling. The audience laughed again. It felt as though the conversation might finally settle into a lighter rhythm. Then the show's producer spoke quietly into the host's earpieces. One host glanced toward the monitor positioned just beyond the audience. Her expression changed. We're getting a lot of live viewer reactions already, she said. The audience murmured with curiosity. Another monitor lit up with comments that had begun flooding in from viewers watching across the country. Some praised Whoopi for asking difficult questions. Others admired Charlize's calm responses. Some believed neither side was entirely right. Others insisted both had made compelling arguments. The discussion had already escaped the studio walls. Whoopi glanced toward the screen. It looks like everyone's having this conversation with us. Charlize smiled. Maybe that's the best outcome. The audience applauded. One comment displayed on the monitor caught everyone's attention. It read, "Disagreement doesn't have to become disrespect." The audience applauded even louder. Whoopi smiled as she read it. I like that. So do I, Charlize replied. Another comment appeared. We're learning more from this conversation than from most celebrity interviews. The hosts exchanged surprised glances. No one had expected an interview promoting a new project to evolve into a discussion about communication itself. One of the co-hosts turned toward Charlize. Do you ever worry that every sentence you say will be taken out of context? Charlize laughed knowingly. I'd be lying if I said no. The audience chuckled. But eventually, she continued, you realize you can't live your life editing yourself for headlines that haven't even been written yet. Whoopi nodded slowly. That's probably true for a lot of people, not just celebrities. Charlize looked toward the audience. Exactly. She pointed gently toward the crowd. Most people have experienced being misunderstood by someone they care about. The room became noticeably quieter. It happens in families. She paused. It happens between friends. Another pause. It happens at work. Several audience members nodded. And now, Charlize added, it happens online every single day. The audience applauded again. Whoopi folded her hands together. So how do we fix that? Charlize smiled thoughtfully. I don't know if we completely can. The room became silent. But I think we start by assuming the other person might have a reason for seeing things differently. Whoopi smiled. I like that answer. Another host leaned into the discussion. Can I ask both of you something? Both women nodded. When was the last time someone changed your mind? The audience immediately reacted with interest. Whoopi answered first. It happens more often than people think. Charlize smiled. I was hoping you'd say that. The audience laughed. Whoopi continued. If you're never willing to change your mind, why bother having conversations? Charlize nodded in agreement. I couldn't agree more. Then she added, but changing your mind and being pressured into agreement aren't the same thing. The audience applauded loudly. Whoopi smiled again. You keep making these distinctions. Charlize laughed. I've had a lot of practice. Everyone laughed. The atmosphere felt lighter now, yet the emotional weight of the discussion remained. One final audience member was handed the microphone. My question is for both of you. The room fell quiet. Do either of you think this conversation would have happened the same way 10 years ago? Whoopi answered first. No. Charlize nodded. I agree. Why? The audience member asked. Charlize took a thoughtful breath. I think we've all become quicker to react. She paused. Sometimes faster than we are willing to understand. Whoopi looked at her carefully. And social media probably hasn't helped. Charlize smiled. It rewards certainty. The audience murmured. But life isn't always certain. Whoopi nodded. No, she admitted quietly. It isn't. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. Even the audience seemed to recognize they were witnessing something unusual. Not an argument. Not a debate. but two accomplished women refusing to simplify complicated ideas. As the conversation approached its scheduled end, the stage manager signaled that only a few minutes remained before the show would cut to commercial. One host smiled. "I think we have time for one final thought from each of you." Whoopi looked toward Charlize. "Ladies first." Charlize smiled appreciatively. She looked across the audience before speaking. "I hope people leave conversations remembering that disagreement doesn't automatically mean disrespect." The audience applauded warmly. Whoopi nodded. "And I hope people remember that asking difficult questions isn't meant to create conflict." She smiled. "It's meant to create understanding." The applause grew even louder. For a brief second, it seemed the conversation had found its perfect conclusion. Then, from somewhere near the front row, a voice unexpectedly called out, "So, are you two friends after this?" The audience burst into laughter. Whoopi laughed. Charlize laughed. Even the hosts couldn't stop smiling. Charlize glanced toward Whoopi. "I'd like to think thoughtful conversations make friendships stronger." Whoopi smiled back. "I can live with that." The audience rose to its feet, applauding as the cameras slowly pulled back. But while the people inside the studio believed the discussion had come to a peaceful close, neither Charlize nor Whoopi realized that clips from the exchange were already spreading online at incredible speed. Edited, debated, praised, criticized, and shared by millions. By the time the show ended, the real storm was only beginning. As the closing music played and the studio lights softened, the applause lingered far longer than anyone expected. Audience members remained in their seats, still discussing what they had just witnessed. Some believed Charlize had delivered one of the most thoughtful responses ever heard on the show. Others felt Whoopi had done exactly what a seasoned host should do by asking difficult questions. Almost everyone agreed on one thing. This conversation would not end when the cameras stopped rolling. Backstage, the atmosphere was noticeably calmer than viewers might have imagined. Charlize accepted a bottle of water from a crew member and thanked everyone who had worked on the production. Across the hallway, Whoopi exchanged a few words with producers before walking toward Charlize. For a brief moment, staff members quietly stepped aside. Charlize smiled first. "I appreciate the conversation." Whoopi returned the smile. "So do I." Neither woman sounded defensive. Neither sounded upset. Whoopi extended her hand. "You challenged me." Charlize shook it warmly. "And you challenged me." They both laughed. "I guess that's what good conversations are supposed to do," Whoopi said. Charlize nodded. "I think so." Nearby crew members smiled, relieved to see that the respect shown on camera had continued behind the scenes. One producer quietly remarked, "I wish people could see this part." Charlize overheard the comment. "Maybe someday," she said with a grin. Meanwhile, outside the studio, viewers had already begun sharing clips from the interview across social media. Short moments from the conversation spread rapidly, often without the context that had made the full discussion so nuanced. One clip focused only on Whoopi's toughest question. Another highlighted Charlize's reply about protecting peace rather than protecting an image. A third showed the audience erupting into applause after Charlize said that thoughtful answers deserved thoughtful listening. Within hours, hashtags inspired by the exchange were trending. Opinion pieces appeared from entertainment writers. Podcast hosts debated who had made the stronger argument. Television critics praised the discussion for remaining civil despite its intensity, while viewers filled comment sections with passionate opinions from every angle. Some wrote that Whoopi had represented the audience by asking difficult questions. Others argued that Charlize had reminded everyone that interviews should be conversations rather than confrontations. Many viewers took away something entirely different. They weren't talking about who had won. They were talking about how refreshing it was to watch two people disagree without shouting over one another. That observation appeared again and again across countless posts. One viewer wrote, "This is what respectful disagreement looks like." Another commented, "I expected an argument. I ended up watching a masterclass in communication." Television analysts discussed the interview during evening entertainment programs, pointing out that the most memorable moments had come not from dramatic outbursts, but from carefully chosen words and long, meaningful pauses. Even people who had never watched the show searched for the full interview after seeing short clips online. Back inside the studio, the audience gradually filtered toward the exits. Many stopped to take photos in front of the stage. Others continued debating the conversation with complete strangers. One elderly couple smiled as they walked toward the doors. The husband quietly said, They never stopped respecting each other. His wife nodded. That's why people won't stop talking about it. Those words seemed to capture the spirit of the entire afternoon. Charlize left the building surrounded by flashing cameras, but she didn't offer a dramatic statement. She simply smiled, thanked reporters for coming, and stepped into her waiting vehicle. Whoopi, leaving through another entrance, was asked whether she regretted any of her questions. She smiled. If a conversation makes people think, then it was worth having. By the following morning, television networks, online commentators, and fans were still discussing the exchange. Some focused on individual quotes. Others analyzed body language, tone, and timing. But the people who had watched the entire conversation understood that the real story wasn't about a winner or a loser. It was about two accomplished women refusing to let disagreement become disrespect. It was about choosing composure over confrontation. It was about proving that the strongest moments on television don't always come from the loudest voices. Sometimes they come from the quiet confidence to stand by your beliefs while still listening to someone else's. And perhaps that was why the conversation resonated with so many people. It reminded viewers that meaningful dialogue isn't about scoring points. It's about understanding perspectives, even when those perspectives never fully align. Long after the studio lights had gone dark, the discussion continued around dinner tables, in workplaces, on podcasts, and across social media. Not because anyone had stormed off the stage, not because anyone had shouted, but because respect had managed to survive disagreement. And in today's world, that alone felt remarkable. What do you think? If you had been sitting in that audience, whose perspective would have resonated with you the most? Do you believe Charlize made the stronger case, or do you think Whoopi asked the questions that needed to be asked? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear your perspective and continue the conversation. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Prime Spotlight, and turn on notifications so you never miss another dramatic, thought-provoking story. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.